It all started with a handshake, one of those moments that feels like a turning point. The kind of handshake where both parties smile, the grip is firm, and there's an unspoken promise of trust and mutual respect. That handshake was the beginning of a professional relationship between Michael, a brilliant black lawyer on the rise, and Richard, a seasoned white businessman with a reputation for making things happen. But as Michael would soon learn, not every promise made with a handshake is meant to be kept. Michael was no stranger to hard work. He had built his career brick by brick, working tirelessly to prove himself in a field where the odds were rarely in his favor. From long nights studying in law school to the grueling early years as an associate, Michael's journey was defined by resilience and determination. By the time he met Richard, he had established himself as a force to be reckoned with, respected in the courtroom and admired by his peers. Success wasn't handed to him, it was earned. Richard, on the other hand, carried himself with a different kind of confidence. He was charismatic, persuasive, and always seemed to be one step ahead. He had a way of drawing people in, making them feel like they were part of something bigger. For Michael, teaming up with Richard felt like an opportunity to elevate his career to new heights. The deal they discussed was ambitious, the stakes high, but the potential rewards were even higher. Michael couldn't ignore the possibilities. It was the kind of case that could define his career. From the outside, their partnership seemed like a perfect match. Michael brought his sharp legal mind and relentless drive, while Richard contributed his business acumen and deep network of connections. Together, they seemed unstoppable. The early days of their collaboration were filled with optimism and promise. Deals were made, progress was swift, and both men seemed to thrive off each other's energy. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. It started with small things, missed meetings, vague answers, promises that went unfulfilled. Michael chalked it up to Richard's busy schedule. After all, success often came with chaos. But as time went on, the discrepancies became harder to ignore. Documents didn't add up, agreements were altered without notice, and money that was supposed to flow into their joint venture seemed to disappear without explanation. Michael's instincts told him something was off. He began to dig deeper, reviewing contracts, emails, and financial statements late into the night. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Richard wasn't playing fair. He wasn't just cutting corners or bending the rules. He was deliberately undermining their partnership for his own gain. The betrayal hit Michael hard. He had put his faith in Richard, trusted him with his reputation, and poured his energy into their shared vision. But now he saw the truth. Richard had never seen him as an equal partner. To Richard, Michael was just a stepping stone, someone to use and discard when it was convenient. The realization stung, but it also ignited a fire in Michael. He wasn't the kind of man to roll over and accept defeat. Michael knew he had to act, but he also knew he had to be smart. Richard was powerful, connected, and ruthless. Taking him on wouldn't be easy, and one wrong move could destroy everything Michael had worked for. But the alternative, allowing Richard to get away with his betrayal, wasn't an option. As Michael began to devise his plan, he reflected on everything that had brought him to this point. He thought about his family, his community, and all the people who had supported him along the way. He thought about the countless barriers he had overcome and the battles he had fought to get here. This wasn't just about him. It was about proving that justice could prevail, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Michael knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew one thing for certain: Richard had underestimated him, and that would be his biggest mistake. Michael sat alone in his office that night, the city lights casting a faint glow through the windows. His desk, usually neat and organized, was cluttered with documents, spreadsheets, and notes scribbled on yellow legal pads. Each piece of paper told part of the story, a story of betrayal, manipulation, and lies. As he pieced the puzzle together, the full scope of what Richard had done began to take shape. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And Michael couldn't shake the thought that he'd been targeted from the start. Thinking back to their first meeting, Michael tried to pinpoint the moment when things began to shift. Richard had approached him with charm and enthusiasm, praising his work and painting a vision of what they could achieve together. It wasn't an easy decision, but Michael knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed someone he could trust, someone who would stand by him no matter what. And if there was one thing Michael had learned in his career, it was that the right allies could make all the difference. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Michael leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He was exhausted, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for his own dignity, for the community that had been betrayed, and for everyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. Michael didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Richard might have underestimated him, but that mistake would be his undoing. And Michael was just getting started. Michael hesitated before dialing Angela's number. He stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. This wasn't just a request for advice. It was a call that could pull her into the storm he was about to face. He trusted her more than anyone, but even trust came with a price when the stakes were this high. Finally, he pressed the button, the familiar sound of ringing filling the silence of his office. Angela answered on the second ring, her voice warm and steady, as if she could sense that Michael needed grounding. He wasted no time, diving into the details of what he'd uncovered. He spoke quickly but carefully, laying out the facts while trying to keep his emotions in check. Angela listened intently, occasionally interjecting with sharp, pointed questions. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Michael," she said finally, her tone serious but calm, "this is bigger than I thought. You're not just dealing with a bad business deal. This is fraud, high-level fraud. If what you're saying is true, Richard could go to prison for this. But you know he's not going down without a fight." "I know," Michael replied, his voice firm. "That's why I need your help. I can't do this alone." Angela agreed to meet him that evening, and for the first time in days, Michael felt a small sense of relief. He wasn't entirely alone in this fight, but as he hung up the phone, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. He had no illusions about what he was up against. Richard was powerful, connected, and ruthless. Taking him on would require not just evidence, but a strategy that anticipated every possible counterattack. That day, Michael went about his usual routine, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself replaying every conversation he'd had with Richard, searching for clues he might have missed. The charm, the promises, the subtle ways Richard had manipulated him. It was all so clear now. Michael had been drawn in, not because he was naive, but because he had wanted to believe in the possibility of an honest partnership. That belief had been used against him, and now it was up to him to turn the tables. Later that evening, Angela arrived at Michael's office with a stack of her own legal books and a laptop. She was all business, her sharp eyes scanning the documents Michael had spread out on his desk. As they worked through the night, piecing together the puzzle, Angela's legal expertise proved invaluable. She pointed out key details Michael had overlooked and suggested strategies for how to approach the case. But as the pieces came together, a new and troubling question emerged. How far did Richard's network reach? Some of the names connected to his dealings were prominent figures in the business world, people with influence in politics and law enforcement. Angela leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about Richard," she said, breaking the silence. "If we go after him, we're going to be stepping on a lot of powerful toes. People who won't want their names dragged into this." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more daunting. This wasn't just a battle against one man. It was a battle against an entire system of corruption and privilege. But backing down wasn't an option. Not for Michael, and not for the community that had been betrayed. As the days passed, Michael and Angela worked tirelessly, building their case and preparing for the inevitable backlash. Michael also began reaching out to others who had been involved in the project, developers, contractors, even former employees of Richard's company. Most were reluctant to talk, afraid of what might happen if they crossed Richard, but a few, emboldened by Michael's determination, came forward with stories that painted an even darker picture of Richard's practices. One contractor revealed that Richard had pressured him to cut corners on safety standards to save money, putting lives at risk. A former employee described how Richard had used offshore accounts to hide profits and evade taxes. And a community leader tearfully recounted how Richard had promised funding for local programs, only to pull out at the last minute, leaving them scrambling to stay afloat. Each story added another layer to the case, but it also added to the weight on Michael's shoulders. The scope of Richard's betrayal was staggering, and the more Michael uncovered, the more determined he became to see it through. But with each step forward, Michael could feel the walls closing in. Richard wasn't blind to what was happening. Michael began noticing unfamiliar cars parked near his home, and his emails were suddenly flooded with anonymous threats. He even received a call from someone claiming to be a concerned friend, warning him to drop the case before it was too late. Michael knew these were scare tactics, but that didn't make them any less unsettling. He couldn't ignore the possibility that Richard's network was larger and more dangerous than he had anticipated. Angela urged him to be cautious, but she also reminded him of why they were fighting. "You've got the truth on your side," she said, her voice steady. "And the truth is more powerful than any threat they can throw at you." Her words gave Michael strength, but he also knew that the truth alone wasn't always enough. He needed to stay one step ahead, to anticipate Richard's moves before he made them. It was a game of chess, and every move mattered. The tension reached a new level when Michael received a call from an old mentor, a retired judge who had always been a source of guidance and wisdom. The judge had heard whispers of what Michael was working on and called to offer a warning. "Michael," he said, his tone grave, "you're on the right side of this, but you're going up against people who don't play by the rules. Be prepared for them to come after you in ways you can't even imagine." Michael thanked him for the advice, but the call left him with an uneasy feeling. He had always believed in the power of the law, in the idea that justice could prevail if you fought hard enough. But now he was beginning to see just how fragile that belief could be in the face of real power and corruption. Still, he refused to back down. As the days turned into weeks, Michael and Angela continued to build their case. Knowing that the moment of reckoning was drawing closer, the tension was palpable, but so was the resolve. Michael wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, manipulated, or betrayed. And as the evidence mounted, so did the stakes. The conflict between Michael and Richard was no longer just a personal battle. It was a clash of values, a fight for justice in a world where power often trumps truth. Michael didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going down without a fight. Michael could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him more than ever. Each day brought new developments, new revelations, and with them, new threats. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls, some from allies offering their support, others from anonymous sources trying to intimidate him. Every step forward seemed to provoke a reaction from Richard's camp, as though they were determined to remind Michael of the power they wielded. The pressure was immense, but Michael refused to let it break him. He had spent his entire life fighting against the odds, proving himself in a world that often refused to see his worth. This was no different. If anything, the stakes made him more determined. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for the truth, for justice, and for the countless lives affected by Richard's schemes. Angela became his rock during this time, her unwavering support a constant reminder that he wasn't alone in the fight. Together, they strategized late into the night, mapping out every possible move and counter-move. They knew Richard would try to discredit them, to twist the narrative and paint Michael as the villain. They had to be prepared for anything. The breaking point came when Michael received a subpoena, a surprise move from Richard's legal team. It was a bold and aggressive tactic, accusing Michael of breaching confidentiality agreements and defamation. The message was clear. Richard wasn't going to wait for Michael to make his move. He was striking first, using the full weight of his resources to bury Michael before the truth could come to light. Angela read through the subpoena with a frown, her sharp eyes scanning every line. "This is intimidation," she said finally, her voice laced with anger. "They're trying to scare you into backing off." Michael nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. He had expected resistance, but this was a calculated attack designed to drain his time, energy, and resources. He couldn't afford to let it distract him, but he also couldn't ignore it. He had to find a way to push back without losing focus on the larger fight. As they worked on their response, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. One of the contractors Michael had reached out to earlier finally agreed to meet with him in person. The man, a soft-spoken and nervous figure named James, seemed hesitant at first, his eyes darting around the coffee shop as though he expected to be watched. But once he began talking, the floodgates opened. James revealed that Richard had pressured him to sign off on falsified permits, threatening to ruin his business if he refused. He had been forced to cut corners, knowing full well that it could have disastrous consequences. The guilt had weighed on him ever since, but he had been too afraid to come forward. Michael listened intently, his heart sinking as James described the lengths Richard had gone to in order to maintain his facade of legitimacy. "This isn't just about money," James said quietly, his hands trembling as he gripped his coffee cup. "It's about control. Richard doesn't just want to win, he wants to destroy anyone who gets in his way." Michael thanked James for his courage, promising to protect him as much as possible. But the meeting left him shaken. It was a stark reminder of just how ruthless Richard could be, and how many lives had been caught in his web of deceit. The tension reached a fever pitch when Angela discovered an overlooked email in the trove of documents they had been reviewing. It was from one of Richard's associates, discussing a wire transfer to an offshore account. The email was cryptic, but it hinted at something much bigger: a potential smoking gun that could expose the full extent of Richard's criminal activities. "This could be it," Angela said, her voice a mix of excitement and caution. "If we can trace this account and link it to the missing funds, we'll have undeniable proof." But as they began digging deeper, they realized the risks involved. The account was tied to a network of shell companies, each more opaque than the last. Tracing it would require resources they didn't have, and every step forward felt like walking through a minefield. Angela warned Michael that pursuing this lead could escalate the situation further, but Michael didn't hesitate. He knew they were running out of time, and this might be their best chance to take Richard down. As they worked tirelessly to unravel the trail, the threats against Michael became more overt. One evening, as he left his office, he found a note taped to his car windshield. The message was simple but chilling: "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Michael clenched his fists, his pulse racing as he scanned the darkened street. He didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Angela insisted he take precautions, urging him to report the incident to the authorities. But Michael knew that even the police couldn't fully protect him. Richard's influence extended far and wide, and trusting the wrong person could jeopardize everything they had worked for. The tension came to a head during a community meeting that Michael had been invited to attend. It was supposed to be a discussion about the stalled real estate project, but it quickly turned into a heated confrontation. Residents demanded answers, their frustration boiling over as they vented about broken promises and shattered hopes. Michael stood at the back of the room, listening quietly as one speaker after another shared their grievances. Finally, someone spotted him and called him out. "You were part of this, weren't you?" An older man asked, his voice tinged with both anger and desperation. "You said this project was going to help us. What happened?" Michael stepped forward, his heart pounding as he faced the crowd. He felt the weight of their disappointment, their pain and their anger. But he also felt the hope that someone would finally take a stand and fight for them. "I made a mistake," Michael began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I trusted someone who didn't deserve it, but I promise you I'm doing everything I can to make it right." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Michael met their gazes, one by one, and saw something shift in their expressions. It wasn't forgiveness, at least not yet, but it was a glimmer of understanding, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, Michael could deliver on the promises that Richard had broken. As he left the meeting that night, Michael knew the clock was ticking. The community deserved justice, and Richard needed to be held accountable. The battle was far from over, but Michael was ready. The stakes had never been higher, and the climax was just around the corner. As Michael drove home from the community meeting, the weight of his promise settled heavily on his shoulders. He had spoken from the heart, but he knew words weren't enough. The people in that room had been betrayed, and they deserved action. Yet, even as he clung to his resolve, a nagging sense of unease crept into his thoughts. Something about the way Richard's camp had responded recently felt off, not just desperate, but strangely calculated. The next day, Angela burst into Michael's office, her expression unreadable, but her movements tense. She dropped a thick folder on his desk without a word, her eyes fixed on him. Michael picked it up and began flipping through the pages. His stomach turned as he scanned the documents, emails, bank statements, and even legal filings, all implicating him. The materials had been carefully curated to make it appear as though Michael had not only been complicit in Richard's schemes, but was one of the masterminds. "They're framing you," Angela said, her voice cold with anger. "This isn't just about stopping you anymore. They're setting you up to take the fall." Michael leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had anticipated retaliation, but this was on a different level. The documents were disturbingly thorough, blending real details with fabricated ones to create a narrative that was hard to disprove. Michael could already see how it would play out. Richard and his associates would distance themselves from the scandal, leaving Michael to face the legal and social fallout alone. "This means we're getting too close," Michael said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "They wouldn't go this far unless they were scared." Angela nodded, but her concern was evident. "We need to be smart about this, Michael. If we don't handle this carefully, they could destroy everything, including you." Michael knew she was right. He couldn't afford to be reckless, but he also couldn't back down. They spent the next several hours devising a plan, analyzing the fake documents for weaknesses and compiling evidence to counter the accusations. Angela suggested bringing in a forensic expert to authenticate the real documents and discredit the forgeries. It was a good idea, but it would take time they might not have. As they worked, another piece of the puzzle emerged. One of the names tied to the offshore accounts appeared in a different context, a lawsuit filed years ago by a whistleblower who had accused Richard's company of fraud. The case had been dismissed under suspicious circumstances, but the whistleblower's testimony hinted at a pattern of behavior that mirrored what Michael had uncovered. Angela tracked down the whistleblower, a woman named Carla who had once worked in Richard's finance department. Reaching out to her was a gamble. She had faced retaliation after her lawsuit and had since disappeared from the public eye. But Michael knew they needed her. If she was willing to speak out, her testimony could be a turning point. When Carla finally agreed to meet, Michael and Angela approached the meeting with caution. Carla was wary, her trust clearly shaken by her past experiences. But as Michael shared what they had uncovered, her demeanor softened. She confirmed many of their suspicions, providing additional details about how Richard's operation worked. She also revealed something neither Michael nor Angela had expected. Richard had ties to a powerful figure in local government, someone who had helped cover up his activities in exchange for kickbacks. "That's why my case went nowhere," Carla said bitterly. "He's not just a businessman, he's protected." The revelation hit Michael like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just Richard they were up against. It was an entire system of corruption that extended far beyond one man. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risks even greater. But the new information also gave them leverage. If they could expose the connection between Richard and his political ally, it would shine a light on the entire network and make it harder for anyone to sweep the scandal under the rug. Michael and Angela decided to move quickly, knowing that the longer they waited, the more time Richard would have to tighten his grip. They compiled their findings into a comprehensive dossier, carefully cross-referencing every piece of evidence. Carla agreed to go on record, despite her fears, and Angela began drafting a legal strategy to protect her from further retaliation. But just as they were making progress, another twist threatened to derail everything. Michael received a call late one night from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm, almost friendly, but the message was chilling. "You're playing a dangerous game, Michael," the caller said. "Walk away while you still can. This isn't a fight you can win." It exposed not only Richard's crimes, but also implicated several figures who had publicly supported the community project, including individuals Michael had once considered allies. The corruption ran deeper than he had imagined, and the fallout was just beginning. In the days that followed, Michael found himself at the center of a media firestorm. Reporters clamored for interviews, and community leaders reached out with messages of support and gratitude. But even as he celebrated the victory, he couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. Something about the timing of Richard's arrest didn't sit right with him. It was almost too convenient, as though someone had orchestrated the events to control the narrative. That suspicion was confirmed when Michael received an anonymous package at his office. Inside was a single document, a confidential memo, suggesting that the whistleblower's decision to come forward had been influenced by yet another powerful figure, someone who had seen Richard as a liability and had used the opportunity to consolidate their own influence. The memo didn't include a name, but its implications were clear. The fight wasn't over. The system that had enabled Richard's rise still had players willing to protect their own interests at any cost. Michael stared at the document, the weight of the revelation settling over him. He had won a battle, but the war against corruption and injustice was far from over. As he shared the discovery with Angela, she sighed, a mix of frustration and determination in her eyes. "This isn't the ending we hoped for," she said, "but it's a start." Michael nodded. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he also felt a spark of hope. They had proven that the truth could be brought to light, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, there was a chance to make a difference. The story didn't end that day, but it marked a turning point, a moment when justice, however imperfect, prevailed against the forces of greed and corruption. For Michael, it was a reminder of why he had chosen this fight in the first place. And as he prepared for the battles still to come, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't fighting alone. The days following Richard's arrest were a blur for Michael. The media frenzy, community responses, and the slow unraveling of the corruption network were almost overwhelming. Everywhere he went, people stopped him to express their gratitude or ask questions. It was clear that the story had struck a chord with the public, and Michael found himself becoming an unlikely symbol of resilience and justice. But even as the dust began to settle, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The anonymous memo had planted a seed of doubt, hinting at a larger game being played behind the scenes. He spent hours with Angela, poring over the evidence again, trying to determine who might have orchestrated Richard's downfall from the shadows. Yet, no matter how deeply they dug, the trail always seemed to lead to dead ends. Whoever was pulling the strings had covered their tracks well. Despite the unanswered questions, there was progress. Carla's courage in coming forward inspired others to speak out, and soon a wave of whistleblowers began sharing their own stories. Contractors, former employees, even a few community members, all came forward with pieces of the puzzle that painted an even clearer picture of the system Richard had exploited. The information led to additional arrests and prompted government investigations into the officials implicated in the scandal. Michael and Angela worked tirelessly to ensure these voices were heard, connecting whistleblowers with legal support and advocating for systemic changes to prevent similar abuses in the future. It was exhausting work, but it felt meaningful in a way Michael hadn't experienced in years. He was reminded of why he had chosen to become a lawyer in the first place, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Meanwhile, the community that had been devastated by Richard's broken promises began to rebuild. Local leaders came together to reassess the real estate project, this time with transparency and input from residents. Michael was invited to participate in the planning sessions, not as a lawyer or a hero, but as a member of the community. It was a humbling experience, and he found himself deeply moved by the resilience and determination of the people he had once felt he had let down. One afternoon, as Michael walked through the neighborhood, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Children were playing in a vacant lot that had once been the proposed site of one of Richard's developments. Their laughter filled the air, And for a moment, Michael allowed himself to feel a rare sense of peace. The lot wasn't a bustling community center or a shiny new housing complex, but it was a space where hope and life flourished. That was a start. As the months passed, the immediate chaos began to subside, replaced by a quieter, more persistent effort to create lasting change. Michael and Angela continued their work, shifting their focus to broader issues of corporate accountability and government oversight. They collaborated with advocacy groups and legal organizations, using the lessons they had learned to push for reforms that would make it harder for people like Richard to manipulate the system. The anonymous memo, however, remained a mystery. Michael kept it locked away in a drawer, occasionally pulling it out when his thoughts wandered back to the question of who had sent it and why. In time, he came to accept that some answers might never reveal themselves. Perhaps the person behind it had acted out of self-interest, or perhaps they had their own sense of justice. Either way, the memo had played a crucial role in exposing the truth, and for that, Michael was grateful. One evening, Michael and Angela met for dinner at their favorite diner, a small place that had become a refuge during their most difficult moments. As they sipped their coffee and reflected on the journey, Angela leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You know, for all the chaos and sleepless nights, I think we did something good," she said. "Something that mattered." Michael nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We did," he agreed, "but it wasn't just us. It was everyone who stepped up, the whistleblowers, the community, even the reporters who kept asking the tough questions. It took all of us." Angela raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To all of us then," she said, her tone light but her eyes serious, "and to the fight still ahead." Michael clinked his cup against hers, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been far from easy, and the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As he walked home that night, the city lights casting a warm glow over the streets, Michael allowed himself a moment to breathe. The battles they had fought had taken their toll, but they had also brought clarity. The pursuit of justice wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He thought of the people who had trusted him, the ones who had shared their stories and taken risks to bring the truth to light. He thought of the community leaders who had stepped into the void left by Richard's schemes, determined to create something better. And he thought of Angela, whose unwavering support had been his anchor through it all. The story that had begun with betrayal and despair had ended with resilience and hope. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still questions unanswered, wounds unhealed, and battles yet to be fought. But it was enough. For Michael, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way forward. As he reached his front door, Michael paused and looked up at the night sky. The stars seemed brighter somehow, their light cutting through the darkness. He smiled to himself, a quiet, private smile, and stepped inside. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he could rest, knowing that they had made a difference. And that was enough.